Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about perception and why it is that even though we might all see the same things, we understand what we see quite differently from the people around us. Perception is a really interesting phenomenon in our lives. We all perceive things just a little bit differently than the people around us. Even the people that are closest to us don't see things exactly the same way we see things. This usually minor difference in perception can make our lives quite interesting at times. So, in this video, I'll explain the process that we all use in gathering our perceptions, and doing that will show why each of us perceive things so differently than the people around us. The process of perception is made up of three different sections: selection, organization, and interpretation. Let's move on to the next scene so we can start going over these different sections. And
I perceive that this class will help me understand why I always get the wrong toppings on my pizza.
maybe. As humans, we can't perceive everything going on in the world around us. It'd just be too much for us to handle. So our brain helps us out a little bit and selects things for us to notice. Right? It looks for things that has certain qualities that kind of stand out from the crowd. Change is also a way that helps us to pay attention to things. Right? Just think back to when somebody moved something in your room. You walk in and you probably notice right away, hey, that chair's not where I left it, right? Self indication is also a way that we tend to perceive things. So, self indication is when you're looking for something specific. An example would be my wife tells me she wants a certain type of car, but I've never seen that car before. Then she shows me that type of car. Suddenly, now, everywhere I look, I see that car. Motives are another method that we use to help us perceive things, right? If we've got certain motives for things that we want or certain motives for things that we don't want, that helps us to perceive things. In a series of experiments in 2013, Balsadis and Dunning showed that people perceive things that they want as being closer than things that they didn't want. So if you see a pile of money laying on the road, you probably perceive it as being closer to you than that pile of poisonous snakes that are also laying on the road. Culture. Culture is the last thing we'll talk about on this slide, and it has a very strong influence on how you perceive things. Different cultures perceive different things as important. That's just the way it is here on planet Earth. So, the culture that you were raised in can have a great impact on how you perceive any particular event. The next subject we're going to talk about is the organization of our perceptions. To do that, I'm going to explain the organization process using cognitive schemata that was first discussed in the constructivism theory. The first schemata that we'll talk about is the prototype. Now, we all have prototypes for almost everything that goes on in our life. The prototype is just the best of whatever or whichever thing you're thinking about. So, an example of this would be we all have a prototype of what the perfect college professor would be. And interestingly, nobody has the same two prototypes. The next thing that we all have is a personal construct. And a personal construct is kind of like a yes or a no gate, right? And we use this to measure people and things and situations. So it's yes, that person is nice, or no, that person is not fun. And we kind of break people down into big piles with those personal constructs. The next type of schemata that we have are stereotypes. So the stereotypes are the schemata that allow us to make a prediction about a person or a situation. And we make that prediction about what that person or that situation will be like. And then we use that in our lives to help guide us and steer us through our lives. An example of a stereotype would be thinking that a member of a fraternity was a dumb party animal because that's what you think about members of fraternities. The last type of cognitive schemata that we'll talk about is scripts. Scripts are exactly like the name says, right? Think of a Hollywood movie, a play, a TV show, whatever. They've all got scripts, and the actors that you see are following the scripts. They may not stick to the script line for line. They might change a word here or a line there, whichever, but they do stay close to the script. That's just like you and me. We have a script running in the back of our brain, and we tend to follow that cognitive script in our lives. All of these schemata can be very, very helpful in our day-to-day life, But they can also cause problems if we aren't cognizant of the fact that we have all these types of schemata and are paying attention to them and how they are affecting us and the things that we do. We need to make sure that we are the ones that are in charge of our lives, not some script that was written for us from something that happened 20 years ago or some stereotype that we picked up from some TV show. The final section of the perception process is interpretation. Interpretation is a subjective process by which we make sense of the world that we perceive. In other words, we tell ourselves a story. To tell ourselves the story of interpretation, we use four different dimensions of attributions or explanations of what we perceive. And then each of these four dimensions has two factors that go along with them. So the first dimension is locus. And the factors that go along with locus are internal and external. With locus, we decide if something is an internal factor or an external factor. And what that means is we decide, somebody did something because, well, if it was internal, we decided that they did it because they were intrinsically good, right? They give to charity because they're good. That would be an internal factor. An external factor would be they gave to charity because the IRS would give them a tax break if they gave to charity, right? So the second dimension of these attributes is stability. And the factors that go along with stability is if something is stable or it's unstable. And what that means is, does it change or is it not likely to change? Right? So is it a ongoing factor of somebody's personality, or is it just something that is unstable? Did they just not sleep well last night? And how do we attribute that to this person? The third dimension that we talk about here is specificity. And the factors that go along with specificity is specific and global. Now remember, we're talking about people here, so it's not worldwide. It's one particular person. But if something is global for a person, it would be something along the lines of, well, she always leaves a big tip. So that's a globally specific thing for that person. Right? And then the fourth dimension is responsibility. And the factors that go along with responsibility are within personal control and beyond personal control. So if we perceive something to be within personal control, obviously we judge it differently than if we perceive something to be beyond personal control. Attribution error number one, as you can see, is the self-serving bias. And it's shown here in this Venn diagram where you've got your self-serving bias and your actual events slightly overlapping, right? Because that's how self-serving bias works. We change our perception to the point that they may not actually mirror real events sometimes. So self-serving bias works in two ways. The first is when we do well in something, we tend to see it as an internal, stable factor that is completely within our control. And then if we do poorly in something, we tend to see it as an external, unstable event that was completely beyond our control, right? If we do well on the test, well, of course I do well on the test. I always do well on the test. I'm very smart, right? And if we do poorly on the test, well, of course I didn't do well on the test. That professor just did a poor job telling everybody what was going on, and the tests were very tricky. Those questions were just impossible to answer, right? So We tend to separate things like that. The second way is we use self serving bias to avoid responsibility for our failures by saying that it's not our fault because that professor made a tricky test, right? So, interestingly enough, self serving bias is culturally related. The second attribution error is the fundamental attribution error. And this type of attribution error, our factor of locus is all out of whack. And typically, it's also a self serving sort of bias going on here. So, what happens with the fundamental attribution error is when other people behave badly, we tend to overestimate the internal causes and underestimate the external causes, right? We see somebody do something bad, we think, well, they're a bad person. We never even think that maybe there was something going on. Maybe they were late for work. That's why they were speeding. We don't know. But when we make a mistake, notice I said mistake and not behaving badly because when it's us, it's just a mistake. We likely underestimate the internal causes and overestimate the external causes that were involved, right? So in that case, we cut ourselves a whole lot of slack that we don't give to everybody else. That's the fundamental attribution error in action. So in this short period of instruction, we've talked about perception as a process and the parts of the process being selection, organization, and interpretation. And of course, the different parts that go into how we select what we perceive, how we organize the different things that we perceive, and of course, how we interpret the different things that we perceive. So, going through all of this, what you should be able to perceive now is how difficult it would be for any of us to actually perceive things the same. There's so much going on in our perception process. It's almost impossible for us to all see the exact same things. And that's why it's important to have empathy with the people around us because we're not right and they're not right. We're all just perceiving different parts of the whole.
I'm so ready to perceive if this pizza finally has the right toppings on it.
I wouldn't mind perceiving a slice of pepperoni pizza right now either. Class dismissed.